Dabar metas pokalbį Pinigų kartoje ir šį vakarą mūsų svečias tikrai ypatingas. Tai yra buvęs Islandijos užsienio reikalų ministras, pirmasis, kuris pripažino Lietuvos nepriklausomybę, Jonas Baldvinas Hannibalsonas. Šiuo metu jis dėsto Vilniaus universitete, tarptautinių santykių ir politikos mokslo institute. Ir mes šį vakarą kalbėsimės apie krizę, apie ekonominę krizę ir apie būdus, kaipgi gyventi toliau po krizinėje ekonomikoje. Ir lietuviams, ir galbūt islandams, ko mes galime pasimokyti vieni iš kitų. So, it's very nice to have you here, Mr. Hannibalson. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And let's start with a little excursion to the past. You were the first foreign minister who visited Vilnius after the events of January 13. How do you see our city and how do you see our country changed?
When I came for the first time, it was in high winter, of course. It was cold, even for an Icelander. It was damp. It was grey. You were an occupied nation. My wife reminds me that when I returned home and she asked me, what was Vilnius like? I used the phrase, Vilnius is like a beauty queen who has fallen on hard times. The city itself was grey and lacked color, but it couldn't hide the fact that Vilnius is a beautiful city. I have been here several times since, yes, and it has been transformed. It is much more colorful, it is much more lively. You see that there is a lot of change going on.
Fast forwarding to the 2008-2009 economic crisis, from your viewpoint, how did Lithuania and how did Iceland cope with the crisis? What were the similarities and what were the differences?
Well, in the case of Iceland, many people, Icelanders, say, well, we are outside the European Union and outside the monetary cooperation. We have our own national currency. We had a twin crisis, a total collapse of the financial system. All the banks and savings institutions, 85% of all money institutions failed. But we also had a collapse of the currency, of our krona, to the tune of almost 100% in a few months' time. That was disastrous.
Yeah.
Because Iceland was indebted, households and businesses were indebted in foreign currency. A devaluation like this means that the stock of debt doubled overnight. It also meant a spurt of inflation. It meant exorbitant rates of interest. And it meant that people couldn't cope. 60–70% of businesses were technically bankrupt. And I would say roughly a quarter of households were basically dispossessed. They couldn't cope.
But there is an economic term coined from your experience, and it's named the Icelandic way of dealing with crisis. Can you elaborate on Icelandic way?
Yes. In the case of Iceland, the banks had piled up debt 10 times the Icelandic GDP. The Icelandic government, in a desperate effort to try to save them to the last moment, had emptied the foreign currency reserves of the central bank, so the central bank became bankrupt. It was a disaster, major disaster. But the point in the Icelandic way, which you were inquiring about, was this. The banks were not bailed out. The banks became bankrupt. They were not bailed out. Who were the creditors? Mainly foreign banks and mainly German banks. Who lost out in the bankruptcy? The creditors. The German banks lost something to the equivalent of 7 Icelandic GDPs. So Icelandic taxpayers did not pay that debt. They had to pay a lot of debt for other reasons, namely because we had to re-establish financial institutions and the state had to refinance them. We didn't bail out the banks because we couldn't do it. They went bankrupt, and that, by hindsight, is rather a blessing.
Why do you think economic crises in Europe and worldwide are becoming more and more frequent?
Financial crises were very rare, and for a long, long stretch after the Second World War, none at all.
Yeah.
So, It is a part of the neoliberal area. Why? Well, because all the lessons about how the financial system is dangerous in itself that we learned in the Great Depression had been forgotten. Enormous investment movements, free movement of capital, yes, searching quick profits. When anything goes wrong and the suspicion comes that someone is not able to repay, then panic and hysteria, withdrawal of funds, and you are left behind with a skeleton of a financial system that was over its head in debt. The simple question is, who is benefiting from all of this? Who is reaping all the interest? Yeah. Who are the markets who are always sort of punishing, ready to punish the national state if it is too indebted? They are the owners of capital, and we have now a lot of information, increasing information about who they are. We talk about the 1% versus the 99%. Elite, global elite, you can count them in few tens of thousands. And their ownership and control over capital and over resources and over income streams in the world is so grotesque that it's almost unbelievable. In the last decade before the crash, Iceland actually became a sort of experiment in neoliberal policies through basically intensive privatization. The banks were recently privatized. Instead of being normal commercial banks serving the community, local community, they became international investment banks and hedge funds. They had easy access to short-term cheap capital because the state was creditworthy with AAA ratings. But in 6 years' time, they piled up debt to the tune of 10 times the Icelandic GDP.
I'll take one phrase from one of your speeches. Dispossessed young Icelandic family, unemployed Irish emigrant, or the young Spaniard without a job, without a home, and without a hope. Who is worse off?
I would say that for the time being, at least, the Spaniard is the worst off. It's a whole generation which is more or less excluded from gainful employment. They've been pushed outside economy, and they have no means of, they have no future prospects unless we have a radical reform. In the case of the Irish, our sister island, they are of course used to emigration. Perhaps Ireland is the country in the world that has, over a long stretch of time, since the hunger of the 19th century, suffered the most emigration. At that time they were 8 or 9 million. They are now reduced down to 3.5. And wherever you go in the world, you meet the Irish. There are more Irish abroad than at home. So they are, the experience of emigration, mass emigration, is familiar to them. To some extent, of course, they benefit from close contacts with the diaspora, especially in the US. If you take my own country, the younger generation, what I call the dispossessed, they would come even after the Spaniards, ahead of the Irish. It is a terrible thing for a young generation who is starting their working career and a new life. They are the most indebted in most societies. Yes, they're buying apartments or homes. And the shock of being both dispossessed, losing whatever you had, losing your apartment, you keep the debt under Icelandic law, you are unemployed and you have to go abroad. We are a small nation. The numbers are not big, and Norway, a booming country, and the other Scandinavian countries are there. And we have, even if we are not within the European Union, in the Nordic Union, there is a common labor market, so it's easy for Icelanders to go there. Basically, the question becomes this. The young people that we lose because of the financial crisis, will they stay over there? Are they lost forever? Or will they return? Because for a small society, there is hardly greater loss imaginable than to lose your best and the brightest and the young and the energetic forever.
Do you think key decisions should and could be made in Lithuania and in Iceland in order to move forward in post-crisis economy, and how these decisions might reflect on life of people?
In the case of my country, Iceland, what I think is most important for us is to learn the right lessons from the experience that we've been going through. And the basic lesson is this: we allowed ourselves to be turned into a guinea pig for a very short-sighted neo-lib policies that turned out to be disastrous and with terrible consequences for a lot of people. What we need to do is to learn from this and go back to where we belong. We should define our place in the community of nations along with the other Nordics. That's where we were before all this. And we should gradually work our way back into the community of the Nordic countries and restore the Nordic model and the Nordic welfare state that we had before. The Nordics and the 3 Baltic states should have it as their aim, inside the European Union or inside outside, to develop our region as a common region, to develop Nordic-Baltic cooperation to such an extent that we can learn from each other and build up a strong entity of small nations that can take care not only of their own internal problems, but also be more influential in the world.
So in a nutshell, we need to learn who our best friends are.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your thoughts, Mr. Hannibalson. Thank you for your time. Tai buvo buvęs Islandijos užsienio reikalų ministras, pirmasis pripažinęs Lietuvos nepriklausomybę, Jonas Boldvinas Hannibalsonas. Su juo kalbėjomės apie praeitį ir, žinoma, pažvelgėme į ateitį.